Hello, all. Today we're going to talk about John Fiske, who is one of my favorite authors that we read this semester. And to get started, I want to show you this video. So I know we're getting kind of meta. You're watching a video that's playing another video. I get that, but still, I think it's worthwhile. So let's take a look at this before we begin our discussion of Fiske.
Would you believe that 1/3 of all 3-year-olds in America have a TV in their bedrooms?
No, I can't believe it.
Yeah,
It's kind of disturbing.
Yeah.
This morning, an influential group of doctors says it is time for toddlers and their parents to turn that TV off. CBS News medical correspondent Dr. John LaPook is here to tell us why. Good morning.
Good morning, guys. The average child under the age of 2 watches 1 to 2 hours of television every day. But the American Academy of Pediatrics said Tuesday that this age group should not be watching any TV or videos at all.
So we are gonna play Mickey Mouse Clubhouse. You ready?
When it comes to television and her 2-year-old son, Ari, Nyla Camlet believes less is more. She allows just 20 minutes a day.
It kind of turns off their brain a little bit. They're not actually having to think. They're not actually having to experience and learn things. Young children learn things by experience. They don't learn things by watching over and over again.
The American Academy of Pediatrics says there's no proven educational benefit from television in kids under the age of 2. In fact, in this age group, TV is linked to short-term language delays and possible attention issues. Research also suggests television watched by adults can distract children playing in the same room. Dr. Laura Jana serves on the committee that studied the issue.
The fact of the matter is there is no proven educational benefit for these sorts of programs for children under the age of 2. And implicit in calling something educational means that a child or whoever is going to be watching it needs to understand the content and the context.
It's unclear if television directly harms the developing brain, but the panel of experts says, at the very least, it takes away time better spent interacting with the real world.
Children, very young children and even older children, learn better and do better with three-dimensional interactions. And I'm not talking about three-dimensional movies. I'm talking about three-dimensional real-life interactions with adults, with their parents, with other caregivers.
Turning.
The Academy of Pediatrics recommends against any media use for children under age 2. But given the reality of today's digital world, it suggests parents closely supervise any programs their children do see.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop that right there. And so normally, if we were in class together, this is where I would ask y'all to talk about this and to get some ideas about what's going on. But since we can't do that, I will suggest to you that there is a lot of bias in what you have seen here. And that indeed, I'm not entirely certain that pediatricians really have the room to say anything about communication mediums, right? I don't come to their pediatrician's office and, counsel them on what I think is ailing children. And so my personal feeling is like, hey, stay in your lane. Maybe you should just, for lack of a better term, shut the fuck up when it comes to interjecting and giving advice in the field of media and when it has to do with children, because frankly, they don't know anything about it. Okay, I admit that, if you sense a little resentment, okay, there's probably a little bit there. And maybe I overstated my case a wee bit. But nevertheless, it is strange, is it not, that folks who specialize in diagnosing croup are giving us insight into how children engage with and or use media? Doesn't that seem strange? Doesn't that seem a little bit outside of the field of their expertise? Well, I would argue that it is a little bit outside of their field of expertise. And one of the reasons why I say this is because, it's betrayed in what the woman there, who is both a parent and some sort of grifter, in marketing educational children's products, what she said, which is this idea that when kids, or anyone for that matter, watches TV, it shuts down part of their brain. This is an old-fashioned kind of way of thinking about engagement with television and moving images. And frankly, it's just wrong. It's old-fashioned, and it's wrong. And this is what Fiske argues in the readings that we look at today. For a
Would
long
you believe
time,
that
whoops,
one-third
sorry about that. For a long time, we thought of audiences as passive, right? Meaning that sort of like what that parent grifter lady said, where she says that well, the kids just sit there and watch it, and it sort of turns off part of their brain. It just sort of washes over them, and that's just simply not true. Fiske wants to challenge the idea that we sit there like couch potatoes, which was the term that was used for kids who watched too much TV in my youth. He wants to fight against this idea. And he wants to say, no, watching a TV show or a movie or what have you is not a passive process. We don't just sit there and receive messages. Now, how do we know this is true? Well, hopefully you understand that this is true just from what we've read so far this semester. For example, with Stuart Hall, we see that with the encoding-decoding model that he works out, that when we watch TV, we're decoding encoded messages, we're making sense of those messages based on our previous lived experience, and we're taking one of at least 3 different possible reading positions based on those experiences. So maybe we agree with part of the text, but we disagree with other parts. Maybe we reject the text completely, right? I mean, there are all these different things going on. So it's not as if we're just sitting there absorbing the messages. We're working. We're working hard when we watch TV to make sense out of the images and the messages, the codes that are being sent out to us, and we're working hard decoding them and making meanings for ourselves out of these messages. So at least on that level, we know that the whole idea of just sitting around and passively receiving televisual messages is wrong. So at the beginning of his article, Fiske makes a distinction between audience members as what he calls textual subjects and social subjects. Now, the reason that Fiske makes this distinction is because for a long time, scholars thought of audience members as what he calls textual subjects, people that were relatively powerless and inactive. So, when you hear about a textual subject, you should think back to our reading of Adorno and Horkheimer, right, who thought that everyone in the audience of the culture industry was just kind of a cultural dupe, right, meaning that they're being manipulated by the images that they see, that the media is a mode of or means of social control, and that people just receive these messages and are brainwashed with their ideology. So that the whole idea there, that audience, the Adorno and Horkheimer audience that is brainwashed, these are textual subjects, right? The powerless and inactive. But what we see is with thinkers like Stuart Hall and other people from the Birmingham School of British Cultural Studies, we begin to imagine audience members as what we call social subjects. And social subjects is a fancy term that we use just to describe real people with real social histories, people who've lived some life, who've had experiences, and then sit down and watch TV. They're not just mindless, automatons that absorb the message, rather, that comes from the screen. These are real people with real histories. So one of the things that I like to do is show this little video of different campaign commercials, and then again, if we were in class, we'd talk about the meaning that you made out of these. It's still fun to watch because they're kind of funny, and we can still talk about them a little bit. So let's check a few of these out.
My name is Linda Paulson, Republican and awesome. Love God and family and the Constitution. I tried to get another conservative to run. Nobody could do it, so I'm getting it done.
Are you a racist? Do you hate Mexicans? The media calls us racist for wanting to build Trump's wall. They censor us, but it doesn't change the truth. Joe Biden's open border is killing Ohioans, with more illegal drugs and more Democrat voters pouring into this country.
In Georgia, we're done with the establishment twin buddy system. I believe in Jesus, guns, and babies. And I believe in putting the Constitution first.
This is a short-barreled rifle. It wasn't designed for hunting.
This is designed to kill people. But if you're not a bad guy, I support your right to own one. The Second Amendment is not about duck hunting. It's about protecting your family and your country.
Democrats like to say that no one needs an AR-15 for self-defense, that no one could possibly need all 30 rounds. But when this rifle is the only thing standing between your family and a dozen angry Democrats in Klan hoods, you just might need that semi-automatic and all 30 rounds.
It's a DC gang! Well, if it isn't Big Jim Lynn.
We're tired of being pushed around.
And open borders.
And gas prices.
The good people of Arizona have had enough of you. It's time for a showdown. I'm Jim Lehman, and I approve this message.
Told you K-Ivy was going to put lead on that target.
Yep, record job creation.
America's strongest pro-life law.
Kate blocked Biden's vaccine mandate.
Banned critical race theory.
Sent troops to the border.
Kate kicked so much liberal butt, I bet her legs tired.
No step too high for a high stepper.
Okay, so I played these. These are all real political campaign commercials that aired in the United States over the past 5 years or so. And I use them as examples to show you, as you watch this, I mean, they're funny, so it's kind of enjoyable that way. But more to the point, you watch these and they express a variety of different extremist, let's say, political views. And as you watched it, you probably were like, oh man, that's terrible, or, ooh, that's too much, or, what have you, right? Who knows? Maybe some of you watched and said, oh boy, what a great commercial. I don't know. My purpose here is not to critique political ideology. My purpose here is to show that, just because we see a message, even an overtly political and ideological message, it doesn't mean that we agree with it, right? No one made those commercials for you to laugh at. But that was my reaction to several of them. So, as a consequence, that shows us that people don't just sit back and absorb the messages. We decide whether or not we agree with the messages. Maybe we laugh at them. I mean, maybe they make us sad. I mean, there's all kinds of different reactions that we can have to these messages that aren't just sitting back and accepting whatever it is that's being said. So, what we see then, and what Fiske details for us, is how scholars like Morley, as part of the British cultural studies tradition, conducted audience reception studies. As we know, the folks in the Birmingham Center were some of the first people to actually go out and speak to audiences to find out what they really thought about the media that they were engaging with. And so what he's telling us here is that the Birmingham people recognize that real people have different backgrounds, and as a result, they read or view text differently, right? They get different meanings out of them. So this brings us to the whole idea of open and closed texts. And I think we've discussed this a little bit already, although I can't remember for certain. Nevertheless, I'll explain it again. So the whole idea of open and closed texts comes from Umberto Eco. Eco was is a Italian philosopher and scholar, and also a popular author. He wrote a number of books years ago, fiction works, including Name of the Rose and Foucault's Pendulum. And these were really popular and kind of New York Times bestsellers. And one of them, Name of the Rose, was made into a movie in the 1980s, early 90s, with Sean Connery and Christian Slater. So Eco's sort of a Renaissance man. But importantly, he came up with this whole idea of open and closed texts. And so a closed text tends to encourage a single interpretation of that text. Open texts, however, have encouraged multiple interpretations, right? So he goes on and he tells us informational texts tend to be more closed and aesthetic texts tend to be more open. So an example of this would be a set of directions, like when you buy your IKEA furniture and you need to put it together. The directions are an informational text, and those want to be closed. In other words, the people making the directions for assembling your IKEA furniture don't want you to interpret those directions in a variety of ways. They attempt to shut down the creation of alternative meanings. So you read, put tab A into slot B. They want you just to know that means put tab A into slot B. They don't want you to misinterpret it. They don't want you to think of any alternative ways to put it together. They want you to put it together just that way, right? Now, more aesthetic texts tend to be open texts. And these are texts that can be interpreted again in a whole variety of ways. And indeed, part of the idea here is that they are open to interpretation. The idea is that you're able to watch the movie or the TV show or read the book and make the meaning that you want to make out of that text. So, generally speaking, classics, or works that we call classics, are very open, meaning that they can be interpreted, again, in a wide variety of ways. One of the examples that I like to use is the Bible. The Bible, although it does have certain sections or certain ideas that are relatively closed, for example, the Ten Commandments are pretty straightforward, the rest of the book, or the majority of the book, offers us stories that could be interpreted in a variety of ways. And we know they can because there's a whole bunch of different styles of Christianity, right? You could be a Catholic, you could be a Lutheran, you could be a Methodist, you could be a Mormon, right? And all these are different types of Christianity, and all these operate, to some extent more than others, but all of these operate off of the Bible, right? And they have wildly different interpretations of the stories that are in there. And, it's not surprising that the Bible has in many ways been the most important book in the past 2,000 years, because it is open to interpretation in this way. And this ensures a kind of popularity and a kind of enduring popularity, I guess I should say, right? Because it's meaningful to so many different people. So, again, things like instructions are closed. Things like the Bible, or A Tale of Two Cities, or Huckleberry Finn, these are open texts, right? That could be interpreted in a variety of ways. So these are your closed texts, right? This is an example of an open text. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom and the age of foolishness, right? You see here, even in this first paragraph, it's so perfectly open in the contradiction inherent in each part of the opening sentence that in a way it plays with its own open nature, right? It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Well, how can it be both, right? But obviously you can interpret this in a variety of different ways. And this lends it a kind of power. Well, it's polysemic, right? It speaks in a number of voices. And an active audience then can come to a text like this, an open text, and interpret it in a variety of different ways. And that's what we're doing when we're making meaning. We're decoding things and we're making meaning. So then an active audience is par for the course. Audiences are not passive. Audiences are always active. And we can think of social subjects, then, you remember the social subject are the people with real histories, as real audiences. And each member of the audience has a different background. This is what Fiske means when he's writing about social subjectivity. So because they have different backgrounds, they make different kinds of meanings out of the films they see, the TV shows that we watch, the books they read, etc. So, for example, I'm a 49-year-old, well, I wrote this when I was 49, I'm a 50-year-old white male college professor from Pennsylvania. Now, if I went to go see a movie like, let's say, Black Adam, I might have a totally different kind of interpretation of that film than a 12-year-old African-American girl attending elementary school and living in Los Angeles, right? Just because we have different life experiences, right? But we're both active, we're both engaging with the same text, but we're making different kinds of meaning. So then again, the key point with Fiske is that audiences are rarely, if ever, passive. When we're watching a movie, reading a book, or watching TV, we're active because we're making meaning out of what we're seeing or reading. And the way that we make sense, or the way that we make meaning out of a text, depends on our life experience. You know, one of the things that I like to point out for students with regard to making meaning is that it's hard work, right? Some of you may read before you go to bed. Why do you read before you go to bed? Well, it makes you tired. Well, why does it make you tired? Because reading, making meaning, is hard work, right? There's evidence that a grandmaster in chess burns more calories during a chess match than an NBA player during an NBA basketball game. Now, how could that possibly be? Well, the answer is that player is thinking so hard, is making meaning out of those pieces and thinking about potential moves and so on, that it burns more calories than a, quote unquote, real athlete. So, again, we're not passive. We're always making meaning, right? So David Morley from Birmingham School was one of the first scholars to examine how real people made sense out of TV shows based on their social subjectivity. And he used ethnography as his method for examining these audiences. Now, he was really primarily interested in occupation and people's jobs and their social class and what kind of differences might exist based on social class and occupation in people's meaning making, right? What he found was that reading the television text is a process of negotiation between this existing subject position and the one proposed by the text itself. But in this negotiation, the balance of power lies with the reader. So then what he's saying is that it's a negotiation between the reader and the text, right? If I sit down and watch that crazy commercial with the old lady, at the gun range shooting up the target, right? There's a message that text wants me to make out of that, right? I'm supposed to think, oh, she's so great, this spunky old lady. She's sassy and she's conservative and she shoots great or whatever, whatever the preferred dominant reading of that is, right? So that's one half of the battle. But the other half of the battle is me sitting here like, what in the world is this nonsense, right? And trying to, and just my sheer kind of incredulity when being faced with that kind of message, right? So there's this battle going on where the text wants me to interpret it one way, but I'm like not really doing that. And so Morley found that the power, ultimately, the decision, like who wins, is the reader, the viewer, right? Me, in other words. So the meanings found in the text shift towards the subject position of the reader more than the reader's subjectivity is subjected to the ideological power of the text. So the reason this is important, and the reason that Fiske brings up Morley in these studies, is because people like Adorno and Horkheimer would say that the ideology of the text always wins. And he's saying, no, not only does it not always win, but it doesn't win most of the time, right? Because it's the reader who's got the real power, not the text. And what this comes down to is that when you make meaning, you're the one doing it. You have control over the message, in a way, right? You can decode a message however you want. And so that gives you an edge. Now, in terms of popularity and popular culture, because, that's what we're studying in part here. In terms of that, Fiske says to be popular, the TV text has to be read and enjoyed by a whole bunch of different social groups. And so its meaning has to be capable of being inflected in a number of different ways. So it's got to be an open text to be popular. To be popular, you have to appeal to all different groups. And to appeal to all different groups, you need an open message that they can interpret, right? No matter which group you belong to. So he says, the television text is therefore more polysemic and more open than earlier theorists allowed for. So what he's saying there is, listen, you got to realize the television text speaks in many voices. It has to. in order to be popular, right? An open text speaks with many voices. It's open to a variety of interpretations. The closed text is the opposite. So then we know what he's saying here, what Fiske is saying, is that in order to be popular, a text has to be open, right? A closed text shuts down different kinds of attempts at meaning making, and therefore can't appeal to as many people. So ultimately, meaning making is a negotiation between the viewer, in the case of television, and the text or the TV show. The text has a dominant reading that's encoded in it, right? But the viewer reader has their own ideas, right? The meaning that's actually made comes out of the negotiation between these two elements. He says the reader produces meanings that derive from the intersection of his or her social history with the social forces structured into the text. So again, maybe I'm a big-time Democrat and I watch a Donald Trump campaign video, and so, ultimately, even though the campaign video is designed to be relatively closed to make me go out and vote for Donald Trump, my social history might preclude me from accepting that meaning. And so, right, it's my subjectivity that ultimately determines the meaning that's taken from that text. Likewise, maybe I'm watching a Joe Biden video and I'm a big-time conservative, and I say, no, that doesn't work. Even though the text is encoded in such a way so that I'm supposed to prefer Biden, my social history might make it so that I don't. And ultimately, it's the edge lies with the person making the meaning. Okay, so that's the discussion of active audiences. Moving on, we get to this idea of activated texts. And so here, Fiske is thinking about some of the devices, right? Some of the things, elements of a text that make it more polysemic, that make it more open. And he says that these devices work against ideological closure, so they work against closing down the text, and they make it more accessible for audiences. So he goes through this list, and I won't belabor the point, but he says irony, right? Appearing to say one thing while actually meaning another. This is something that's used in activated text to make them more open. Metaphors, describing one thing in terms of something else. Jokes help us open a text through what he calls the collision of discourses, or different ways of speaking or writing. And then contradictions, rather. If texts that bear the dominant ideology are to be popular amongst those who are oppressed or subordinated by that ideology, they must contain contradictions, however repressed, that oppositional readers can activate to serve their cultural interests. Without them, the text could be popular only amongst those who accommodate with dominant ideology. So what he's saying here is that if you want to make you have to make an open text for it to be popular, but if you want to make a popular ideological text, you at least have to include contradictions in the text itself. Little things that people can grab onto, right, and make sense out of. In this sense, we can understand them as possessing heteroglossia, right, or heteroglossia, which is terribly hard for me to pronounce. And this is the presence of two or more viewpoints in one text, right? The idea, there are contradictions oftentimes in our stories where maybe the good guys aren't really entirely good, for example. Breaking Bad comes to mind, or The Sopranos, and these kinds of texts. He goes on, he talks about excess hyperbole, right? Again, I won't, I don't expect you to memorize these things or have a deep understanding of them, but I want you to at least be able to think about how they tend to make texts more open. So if we go over the top with hyperbole, we can present the dominant ideology, but at the same time sort of critique it through our own overstatement, let's say. Indeed, Fiske tells us that excess allows for subversive, or at least parodic, subtext to run counter to the main text. So One example of this might be something like Team America World Police, which includes a song entitled America Fuck Yeah. The whole idea is that it's so over the top, so hyperbolic that, it's actually a kind of critique of patriotism or jingoistic kind of patriotism. So then he says the television text, like all text, is a site of struggle for meaning, right? I mean, popular culture, we know, is a site of struggle. And so the text, like popular culture, is a site of struggle. And it's a site of struggle because the structure of the text, the way it's put together, typically tries to limit its meanings to those that promote the dominant ideology. But the polysemy, right, or the fact that the text speaks in multiple voices, sets up forces that oppose this control. At the same time, TV's very economics, at least in the age of broadcast TV, worked against its ability to exert ideological control over passive viewers. It was always and has always been audiences that make text popular, not television producers. So, you could put out a very ideological show, but people don't have to watch it, and it's the people, the consumers, who have power in that scenario, not the producers, right? If the producers could make text popular, believe me, everyone would be that they make, but they're not. And the reason that they're not is because much of the control, much of the power in this negotiation lies with the viewer. So again, we come back to this idea of open text, and Fiske tells us that TV texts are open, but they're not highbrow, right? They're not high class. And Echo, in his model of the open text, says that they're usually high class, high art, right? And closed texts are more lowbrow. Well, Fiske says TV texts are open, but they're not high class, so he makes a new category, and he says they're producerly. And he says producerly texts are open like highbrow texts, but speak to readers in a language they understand and count on the reader to interpret in their own way. So, they're similar to these old-fashioned highbrow sort of classic high art, high culture texts, but they speak to the audience in a language they can understand, right? Okay. Well, that does it for Fiske. I hope that you learned something, and I appreciate you sticking with me through this lecture. See you next time.